The Beatles were instrumental in the cultural upheaval of the 1960s, influencing the time with their innovative sound. However, the Fab Four were absent at Woodstock, the most famous historical event, when 500,000 spectators congregated. Why did they lose out on a generation's turning point while their influence was high? Was it a change in creativity, internal conflicts, or something far more surprising? The truth is still more complicated than most people realize, even as rumors abound about lost chances and unseen disputes. Come along as we reveal the valid reasons why the Beatles did not perform at Woodstock and how their absence permanently altered the course of music history. Tensions within the Beatles. The Beatles were not the close-knit group they had been by 1969. The band was disintegrating due to personal conflicts, creative disagreements, and ego clashes, particularly between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. John, who Yoko Ono and experimental sounds influenced, wanted to go differently, but Paul fought for a return to their previous structured manner. Ringo Starr was frequently caught in the middle, while George Harrison felt overshadowed and disgruntled with his meager songwriting efforts. Recording sessions became battlefields with notorious incidents like George momentarily leaving the band in early 1969. It seems almost unthinkable that they'd have to set aside their differences for a vast live performance. The band was already disintegrating when Woodstock arrived in August, so discussing a cohesive performance was implausible. Instead, they concentrated on finishing Abbey Road, their last album to be recorded together, before formally breaking up a year later. Their reluctance to perform live. The Beatles had become increasingly dissatisfied with touring by the middle of the 1960s. Chaos characterized their 1966 U.S. tour. They could hardly hear themselves playing due to the deafening cries of the fans, and they were afraid for their safety after John Lennon's controversial "bigger than Jesus" comment. The band felt their creativity was being hindered, and their live performances had shifted from being about music to being more about spectacle. Following a last performance at Candlestick Park in San Francisco in August 1966, they formally ceased traveling to concentrate only on studio work. By 1969, they were used to creating complex recordings that were impossible to recreate on tape, complete with orchestral arrangements, overdubs, and studio procedures. Woodstock didn't fit their new artistic orientation because of its unvarnished and unpolished nature. The Beatles had become a studio-first band, unlike bands like The Who or Jimi Hendrix who flourished in live environments. They just didn't like retaking the stage in such a crazy festival setting. Yoko Ono's influence on John Lennon. One of the most contentious topics among the Beatles was John Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono. By 1969, she regularly participated in recording sessions, frequently raising her voice and influencing John's artistic choices. Although Ringo, Paul, and George had initially accepted her attendance, things quickly became tense, with Paul especially believing that John was putting Yoko before the band. The Beatles' dissolution had been unjustly attributed to Yoko by some fans and critics, but John was already moving away from the band. He was more interested in activism, avant-garde music, and his endeavors with Yoko, such as the experimental wedding album. John probably didn't want to perform at Woodstock since it would have exposed their strained relationship to much public scrutiny. He was more concerned with spreading his message of peace than performing for large audiences. He and Yoko organized the well-known Bed-In for Peace demonstration the same year. It was almost hard for the Beatles to reunite at Woodstock since his thoughts were elsewhere. Legal issues surrounding the Beatles. Behind the scenes, the Beatles were engulfed in legal and financial issues, but to fans, they were a band of musicians transforming the world. Their self-owned business, Apple Corps, was in financial ruin due to poor leadership, excessive spending, and poor management. Deep splits had developed by 1969 due to conflicts over commercial matters. Paul vehemently opposed Alan Klein as their new manager and preferred his in-laws at Eastman and Eastman, while John, George, and Ringo supported him. The band members became even more antagonistic due to this internal power struggle, which made it hard to concentrate on the music, much less dedicate to a large-scale event like Woodstock. The Beatles' time was spent mainly fighting over contracts and legal issues rather than getting ready for a legendary live performance. This conflict would only become worse following their official split in 1970. The idea of performing together at Woodstock was out of the question, since they were too busy with money problems and lawsuits. Timing conflicts with their schedule. The Beatles were busy throughout the summer of 1969, but not to the extent they could be at Woodstock. They were focused on recording Abbey Road at the time, which would turn out to be one of their best-known albums. They concentrated on creating their last joint project before formally breaking up, as emotions were already running high. The sessions were heated, with Ringo becoming increasingly aloof, Lennon and Harrison arguing, and McCartney attempting to keep the group together. Additionally, they had to cope with incomplete Let It Be recordings that would be released after the dissolution. It would have disrupted the creative process and put more strain on a fragile ensemble to leave the studio for a considerable festival performance. The Beatles were already the most prominent band in the world and had no incentive to fit in a live concert, unlike artists like The Who or Santana, who saw Woodstock as a chance to gain recognition. The Beatles' shift to studio work. Pushing the limits of what could be accomplished in a recording studio, the Beatles revolutionized the music-making process by the late 1960s. Masterworks of layered instrumentation, experimental approaches, and intricate production were found in albums such as The White Album and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Complex arrangements in songs like Happiness is a Warm Gun and A Day in the Life would have been tough to perform live. By 1969, they were far more interested in studio innovation than live performance. The Beatles were more interested in making meticulously planned art pieces than bands that flourished at improvised live environments. They could control the sound and experience, even at their 1969 rooftop concert and ultimately their final live performance. In contrast, Woodstock was an unruly and chaotic environment that didn't fit their creative vision. They stuck to their studio-first strategy rather than adjusting to the festival vibe. The influence of the British invasion. Few musicians could hope to achieve the recognition and impact that the Beatles had by the time Woodstock took place in 1969. They'd revolutionized the music industry as the leaders of the British invasion, opening the door for many bands like the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Who. The Beatles had nothing left to prove, unlike the musicians still making their names at Woodstock. They had impacted a whole generation, altered the direction of rock music, and performed before record-breaking crowds at Shea Stadium. Despite being historic, Woodstock wasn't essential for them. Instead, it was more pertinent to up-and-coming musicians trying to establish themselves. Instead of pursuing another live performance, the Beatles concentrated on completing their illustrious career by 1969. The counterculture movement was shaped by the Beatles years before Woodstock solidified it. Playing the festival would have been unnecessary for them and wouldn't have significantly added to their already innovative legacy. The burden of fame. The Beatles had evolved from a band to a cultural phenomenon by 1969. Although their fame was unmatched, it also came with oppressive demands. In contrast to their early years of fervent traveling, they'd ceased live performances by 1966 due to exhaustion from Beatlemania. They would have been far more closely watched at Woodstock with its 500,000 attendees and heavy media coverage. Later, Paul McCartney noted that yelling fans frequently overpowered the music during tours, which had become more chaotic. John Lennon had also complained about their lack of control over their performances, calling their last live performance uninspired. Their reluctance to do large-scale performances by the time made Woodstock an undesirable option, and the practices of overseeing their security at such a huge event would have been a nightmare. The Beatles, once emblems of adolescent revolt, were growing increasingly disillusioned with their star status and the demands it placed on them, despite the festival's reputation for freedom and unity. Personal lives taking priority. The Beatles were not the close-knit group they had been by 1969. To prioritize family life over the hectic schedule of live performances, Paul McCartney had started to settle down with Linda Eastman. John Lennon, becoming increasingly dependent on Yoko Ono, was moving away from Woodstock's rock-heavy lineup and towards activism and avant-garde endeavors. George Harrison, meanwhile, had spent time in India with Ravi Shankar and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and he was profoundly enmeshed in Eastern spirituality. He had little enthusiasm for playing at essential festivals because of his increasing disenchantment with the band. Frequently disregarded when making important choices, Ringo Starr juggled his father's obligations and resolved conflicts inside the band. Due to their different trajectories, it was nearly impossible for them to coordinate their interests and schedules for a single event, much less one as demanding as Woodstock. Any significant commitment felt like an uphill battle because, by that point, the Beatles had lost their unity from the height of Beatlemania. The shift in music culture. By 1969, there had been a significant change in rock music. Despite transforming commercial music earlier in the decade, the Beatles' changing style set them apart from the burgeoning counterculture movement. Artists like Jimi Hendrix, The Who, and Janis Joplin, who personified the festival's rebellious spirit, performed at Woodstock in an unvarnished and unadulterated manner. Conversely, the Beatles were increasingly linked to complex studio works that would have been challenging to replicate live, such as Abbey Road and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Furthermore, the festival's psychedelic rock and folk revival acts seemed to have more raw energy than its polished stage sound. The Beatles may have felt alienated at a gathering representing the next generation of music rebels, but by 1969 the cultural shift was passing them by. Financial concerns with Woodstock organizers. Despite their lofty goals, Woodstock's organizers were beset by serious financial difficulties. Originally anticipated to attract 50,000 or so, the festival immediately went over its capacity and attracted 500,000 people. Attendees swarmed the venue without paying, making ticket sales meaningless and causing a financial catastrophe. The Beatles, already embroiled in financial troubles due to Apple Corps' poor management, were not likely to be lured into another risky endeavor. The lack of economic stability surrounding Woodstock would have been a significant disincentive, and John Lennon in particular had been skeptical of how huge events were handled. In addition, the Beatles, renowned for their painstaking studio work, may have been concerned about how their performance would have been perceived in such a chaotic circumstance, given the technical and organizational problems that beset the festival. Ultimately, the band already had enough managerial and financial issues, so participating in a festival with precarious finances was not enticing. The role of Brian Epstein's death. The Beatles' career underwent a sea change in 1967 with the death of Brian Epstein. As their manager, Epstein had served as the foundation of the band's organization, managing business affairs and maintaining harmony among the members. His absence resulted in power disputes, a loss of direction, and growing disarray. Paul McCartney tried to assume a leadership position, but becoming more autonomous and rebellious, John Lennon opposed his influence. The Beatles had difficulty deciding without Epstein to mediate and provide expert advice. Since there was no longer a strong managerial presence to oversee their appearances, their hesitancy to commit to live performances indicated their lack of leadership. Epstein could have convinced them to attend if he'd been living and recognize the benefits of Woodstock. Instead, the band grew more dispersed without him, diminishing the likelihood of such a huge show. The nature of Woodstock's message. Although the Beatles were frequently regarded as symbols of the counterculture of the 1960s, their genuine political engagement was far more complex. A declaration of peace, anti-establishment principles, and community living, Woodstock was more than just a concert. Although John Lennon advocated for activism and peace, the band had never been as overtly political as some peers. While the Beatles had typically voiced their opinions more covertly through music than public protests, several of the performers at Woodstock, like Joan Baez and Country Joe and the Fish, utilized their platforms to oppose societal injustices in the Vietnam War. The Beatles also had little interest in joining a movement that did not entirely fit their changing ideologies by 1969, as they were headed in various artistic and personal directions. Their absence from Woodstock was due to a fundamental divergence in identity and messaging, not just practical considerations. The pressure of public expectations. The Beatles changed what it meant to be a worldwide rock band during the 1960s. Their actions were closely watched, and high public expectations burdened them. Tensions within the band had reached an all-time high by 1969, and they already had difficulty remaining together. They would have been under tremendous pressure to perform flawlessly because they would have attended a historical event like Woodstock. But they were no longer the same band that had once flourished on stage after years of concentrating on elaborate studio records rather than live performances. They were becoming more conscious of the possibility that a poor performance at Woodstock would have tarnished their reputation. The Beatles ultimately decided to concentrate on their studio work, culminating in Abbey Road, an album that would have become one of their finest accomplishments, rather than taking the chance of an unpredictable live performance in front of 500,000 people. The influence of psychedelia. Groundbreaking albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the Beatles themselves played a significant role in influencing the psychedelic movement. Songs like Tomorrow Never Knows and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds perfectly captured the experimental, mind-expanding vibe. But by 1969, the group had strayed from the strong psychedelic elements praised at Woodstock. Their later compositions, such as Abbey Road and the White Album, indicated a move toward more minimalist, introspective music. In the meantime, Woodstock continued to flourish because of performances by groups like Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix, which capitalized on the psychedelic revolution's leftovers. The Beatles had already entered a stage of introspection and self-discovery, even as the festival celebrated extravagant color. Harrison was deeply enmeshed in Indian spirituality, McCartney was drawn to raw, back-to-basic rock, and Lennon launched avant-garde ventures with Yoko Ono. For them, Woodstock felt more like a movement of the past than a future they wished to embrace because of this artistic disparity. Concerns about Woodstock's safety. Although the event was chaotic and unpredictable, due to its vast size, Woodstock is frequently remembered as a beautiful celebration of music and unity. Nearly 500,000 people descended upon the event grounds, exceeding the organizers' initial projection of 50,000 guests. Inadequate security, medical crises, and food shortages made the performance environment unstable. After dealing with deadly fan mania during their touring years, the Beatles had grown more cautious of big, uncontrolled crowds. The band found Woodstock an unpleasant sight due to inadequate crowd control, erratic weather patterns, and inadequate logistical planning. Paul McCartney also expressed worries that security concerns and the weight of public expectations were making live performances too dangerous. Since 1966, they had sought refuge in the studio, so going back to such an unregulated environment would have felt like re-entering the chaos they had fought so hard to escape. The impact of Altamont. Although Woodstock is frequently seen as the apex of the peace and love movement, the Altamont Free Concert in December 1969 revealed the darker side of big festivals only a few months later. The Rolling Stones organized Altamont, which descended into violence and claimed many lives, including Meredith Hunter, who Hell's Angels guards famously stabbed. Despite occurring after Woodstock, this incident highlighted the risks associated with large-scale outdoor performances. Altamont would have been perceived by the Beatles, who were already hesitant to perform live again, as evidence that big-scale gatherings were unpredictable and frequently dangerous. Similar worries were at Woodstock even before Altamont, where many injuries were caused by overworked medical personnel and chaotic circumstances. It would have been ironic for John Lennon, who had always been outspoken about his support for peace, that these events may turn violent. It's possible that the Beatles avoided being linked to the growing unpredictability of music festivals by staying away from Woodstock, whether on purpose or not. The Beatles' disillusionment with fame. The Beatles were no longer the upstart band that had swept the globe in 1964 by 1969. Internal tensions and years of unrelenting attention and scrutiny have taken their toll. In particular, John Lennon had become disillusioned with the demands of the public and frequently turned to his relationship with Yoko Ono as a means of escape. George Harrison had begun pursuing more individualized artistic pursuits due to his growing dissatisfaction with the band's lack of creative space. Their changing views on celebrity collided with the very split of Woodstock, wild, young, and joyous. It might have felt like a step backward into a society they were attempting to escape to take the stage at a counterculture festival in front of hundreds of thousands. The Beatles sought methods to separate themselves from their moment in the spotlight, while many other Woodstock musicians enjoyed it. The influence of drugs and counterculture. Although the Beatles had been instrumental in developing the counterculture and psychedelic movements, their relationship with both had drastically changed by 1969. The Lonely Hearts Club Band, led by Sgt. Pepper, had embraced the vibrant, psychedelic world of the late 60s. But the White Album marked a dramatic shift into more raw and intimate musical territory. Specifically, Lennon and Harrison had become disillusioned with the counterculture movement's excesses. John's expanding political and personal interests and George's growing devotion to Eastern spirituality caused them to drift away from the drug-fueled revolt that still defined Woodstock. Furthermore, even though Paul McCartney acknowledged his previous experience, he had publicly expressed his condemnation of the excesses associated with drug usage. The Beatles no longer viewed themselves as representatives of the movement they had previously aided in creating by the time Woodstock arrived. Not only was their absence from the festival practical, but it also demonstrated their increasing disengagement from the culture that Woodstock stood for. The rise of solo projects. The Beatles members were already veering into various creative paths when Woodstock happened. John Lennon worked closely with Yoko Ono on experimental projects, especially with the Plastic Ono Band. George Harrison started accumulating songs that would eventually make up his solo masterwork, All Things Must Pass, because he was dissatisfied with his small part in the Beatles. Paul McCartney had been recording at home while teasing his future solo endeavors. The Beatles were no longer functioning as a coherent group, as seen by the rise of these standalone initiatives. Bands had to be dedicated to Woodstock, a festival that promoted musical unity and collaboration. The Beatles, however, were not at all united in 1969 and were in danger of disbanding. Their absence from Woodstock represented the band's unavoidable demise rather than merely a lost chance. The Beatles and American politics. Woodstock was a political statement in addition to being a musical festival. Many of the musicians at Woodstock aggressively expressed their political views when the Vietnam War was still going on and social movements for peace and civil rights were at their height. The performances of Joan Baez, Country Joe McDonald, and Jefferson Airplane served as a rallying cry against injustice and war. The Beatles were not as directly associated with activism as some of their Woodstock contemporaries, although having touched on political issues, most notably with Revolution and Give Peace a Chance. Despite being vocal on a personal level, John Lennon had not yet fully embraced the political movements that would define his solo career. The Beatles may have been reluctant to be drawn into an event strongly associated with a particular political statement, so they chose not to attend Woodstock. The Beatles opted to let their music speak for itself, rather than get directly involved in the political movements of the day. in contrast to Bob Dylan, who likewise decided to separate himself from the event. Lack of desire for a comeback moment. For many artists, Woodstock became a turning point. For others, it was a cultural rebirth. For instance, many people list Jimi Hendrix's incredible performance as one of the festival's highlights. However, the Beatles had already established themselves as the most influential band in history, so they didn't need a comeback. A band that had already achieved the height of musical success and concentrated on their personal and creative development didn't need to return to the stage to perform in front of a large audience. Fear of repetition. The Beatles were renowned for pushing boundaries and reinventing themselves in their musical and creative endeavors. By 1969, they no longer needed to reenact earlier performances. Although Woodstock was hailed as the height of countercultural music, the Beatles had already established themselves and had no intention of returning in time. Given that they were already about to start new solo ventures, performing at an event like Woodstock would have felt like a step backward. The impact of the Vietnam War. Especially in the 1960s, the Vietnam War had a significant impact on world politics. Many of the Woodstock performers were politically active and expressed their opposition to the war through their performances. However, the Beatles had always been more circumspect regarding their political activism. Even though John Lennon would go on to become well known for his vocal advocacy, the band was not ready to use their music to express political views like the Woodstock singers did by 1969. They might not have felt comfortable participating because of the event's significant political overtones. The Beatles and the end of an era. Woodstock marked the end of an era in many respects and was more than a festival. The late 1960s also marked a period of change for the Beatles. They were no longer the youthful, inexperienced band that caused Beatlemania to take the world by storm. They were older now, wiser and more self-reflective. The Beatles' stage of life and work did not coincide with the spirit of youth rebellion that characterized Woodstock. They were prepared to move on because they saw the 1960s as coming to an end differently. The changing role of the Beatles in pop culture. The Beatles were no longer just a rock group. They were now world-renowned. They were now the cultural fabric itself, not merely the component. By 1969, their impact had extended into philosophy, politics, fashion, and film. If they had attended Woodstock, they would have been perceived as relics from a bygone, more innocent time. The Beatles were no longer the face of changing cultural revolution. Their absence from Woodstock signaled their gradual transformation from pop stars into something more nuanced and grown up. The Beatles' influence on Woodstock. Despite not playing at Woodstock, the Beatles' influence was nevertheless felt there. The band's music and philosophy greatly inspired many artists and audience members. In many respects, Woodstock was a celebration of the spirit of love, peace, and artistic freedom that the Beatles helped to spark. The Beatles' absence from the festival strengthened their position as the defining force of the 1960s, rather than lessening their cultural influence. Both the countercultural movement that the Beatles had influenced and their legacy were honored at Woodstock. If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon